Let everybody know that you are, as attendees, you are in listen only mode for this webinar, but you do have the ability to submit questions to us. And in terms of some of the logistics for this webinar, we are encouraging you to post those questions at any time. Send those in to us. We are saving some time at the end of the webinar to handle discussion with our panelists and have them weigh in and respond to some of your questions. We posted a copy of the webinar slides and will be posting a copy of the recording at the link that you see here on the screen. That is something I'm going to push out to you via chat in just a moment. So you'll have that. You can access it and pull up those slides as we go or refer to them later. We did get the webinar approved for 1.5 CM credits through the American Institute of Certified Planners. So if you need those, you know where to find them, hopefully in their event calendar. We're also going to provide certificates of attendance to you all showing 1.5 hours of instruction completed after you complete a brief webinar feedback form at the end of the session. I'll provide some more detail about that later. You can also expect to see a follow-up email coming from us tomorrow with links to all this stuff, how to get your certificate, the recording, all that information, so you can refer back to it. So today, what we really want to do is first understand and define the role that dark conditions play in pedestrian safety outcomes in both determining the risk of crashes and then the severity of the crashes that may occur with pedestrians. We want to also talk about and review some recommended practices from FHWA for lighting improvements, and we'll hear a bit about a primer that is available to you for doing that work. And then we're going to talk about some community efforts in the Portland, Oregon area that are underway to focus some attention about the issue of lighting and other factors. So we've got a team from Oregon Walks who are going to share some of their story from the work that they've done. We have a brief agenda. The one thing that I didn't just mention is that George Merritt is here from FHWA to kick things off with a description of a new lighting initiative focused on lighting from FHWA. So we'll hear about that first. Dr. Rebecca Sanders will talk about kind of what we know about this problem of lighting or dark conditions. We'll hear about the FHWA lighting primer from Michael and Matt. And then the team from Oregon Walks, Brandon and Zachary. Unfortunately, Scott not with us today, but they'll share some of the work that they've done on this topic before our discussion period. So let's go ahead. I want to introduce you to the panelists who are here. So first, George Merritt is a senior safety and geometric design engineer with the Federal Highway Administration's Resource Center. He is responsible for deploying new technology to improve safety on our nation's highways through the application of performance-based practical design, intersection and interchange design, nighttime visibility, and predictive safety methods. We're also joined by Dr. Rebecca Sanders, who founded Safe Streets Research and Consulting to provide data-driven insights into pedestrian, bicycle, e-scooter, and driver safety, behavior, and mobility. She has 16 years of academic and private sector experience studying roadway user safety, contributing to national design guidance, and helping cities and counties across the country pursue Vision Zero and systemic safety efforts. Michael Dunn is a transportation engineer on VHB's safety team. He's co-authored several FHWA resources related to pedestrian and bicyclist safety, practical application of the safe system approach, complete streets, and other key safety topics. Matt Stygles is a transportation engineer at VHB with 10 years of professional experience. With a background in traffic engineering and signal design, he's an experienced lighting designer and leads the development of lighting plans for a variety of outdoor applications, including roadways, interchanges, pedestrian and bicyclist facilities, and site developments. And I mentioned our team from Oregon Walks that's joining us today to talk about their work. We have Brandon Summers, who coordinated the Oregon Walks pedestrian crash review, who will share insights about that process of obtaining, recording, and presenting detailed information about crashes. We're also joined by Zachary Lauritsen, who's the interim executive director at Oregon Walks. He began his career in a different world, public education, and as a high school coach, teacher, and administrator, Zachary developed an approach to advocacy: make it interesting, make it engaging, and make it fun. So we've got a great panel here today. I'm excited to get into it. So what we're going to do now is turn things over to George Merritt to kick things off about some new initiatives from FHWA. George, you can share your screen whenever you are ready.
Thanks, Dan. And wanted to say thank you for everybody to take the time to spend to talk about something that's very important to the Federal Highway Administration. I'm particularly here today to talk about a new initiative that is just sort of breaking out into the public space. Myself and two others within our agency are going to be leading an initiative called Nighttime Visibility for Safety. And it's with the Everyday Counts program, the Everyday Counts 7 the 7th version of the program. And I just wanted to quickly highlight a little bit about what we're going to be trying to accomplish so that hopefully we will get some engagement from some of the folks that are going to be on this, are participating on this webinar. So the Nighttime Visibility for Safety Initiative is basically trying to address yet another part of the roadway safety problem. You know, Federal Highway Administration has a focused approach to safety. We've been focusing on 3 main types of safety problems: the intersection safety problem, the problem with bicyclists and pedestrians, and then the problems associated with roadway departure safety. Combined, these account for about 90% of all highway fatalities in any given year. The Nighttime Visibility for Safety Initiative is going to be trying to come up with cost-effective and proven strategies that will help to improve safety in all 3 of these different types of areas. We are going to be very targeted, and we are going to be ranging from anything from additional or enhanced traffic control devices all the way up to targeted lighting solutions to try to take advantage of the modern technologies available in roadway lighting in specific environment conditions. We believe that improving visibility along these corridors at intersections and pedestrian crossings will help to reduce nighttime fatalities, particularly for bicyclists and pedestrians and other vulnerable road users. And we are really going to be trying to get these kinds of strategies and countermeasures out that are going to be low cost, hopefully, in most cases, and relatively easy for any agency to go out and to apply in a specific location where the risks might be higher. It is breaking now, but I do want to just point out a couple of things, and this is my last slide. But Joe Chung, Tori Brinkley, and myself are co-leading this initiative. We've got representatives from Federal Highways and several other state DOTs. I've got a couple of links on here, but I want to point on the top left corner of this screen. We are going to have our virtual summit on the Everyday Counts initiatives. It's going to be taking place on February the 14th through the 16th. The website here, it's a little bit tricky to find on Google, but I would like to strongly encourage anyone with an interest, particularly in nighttime visibility, to try to register for this. We would like you guys, if you're not already working for a state Department of Transportation, we would really like to encourage you to reach out and try to work with your state, as well as collaborate with Federal Highways through the EDC 7 initiatives. And the best opportunity to do that is going to be to participate in the summit, where we're going to start to work through some of the feedback that we're going to be getting from our partners and others around the country to refine the targets of what we're going to accomplish over the next 2 years. I also want to point out on the right-hand side, we've got a website. It is very easy to find. Just type in FHWA and EDC 7, and you'll find a link to the Nighttime Visibility for Safety webpage. So that's all I've got, and I really appreciate the opportunity to share this information with everybody, Dan. Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much. Thanks, George. So I did just share a few links in the chat, a lot all at once, but the last 2 were some of the links that George has been discussing, the Visibility for Safety initiative, and then the virtual summit registration. So hopefully you saw those. If you didn't, send in a question, let me know, and I can get those out to you. So thanks again, George. We are going to shift gears now and ask Dr. Rebecca Sanders to tell us a little bit about, from research that has been done, what do we know about this problem of darkness and pedestrian safety, and kind of set the stage for some of the discussion to be happening later. So Rebecca, whenever you are ready, you can bring your screen up.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Let me know if this comes across. Everybody see that?
It looks great. Thank you.
Great. Okay. Well, thanks everybody for having us and for joining us today for this critical topic of pedestrian safety. I am going to talk to you specifically about some research that I did with some colleagues, Dr. Bob Schneider at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee and Dr. Frank Prue at Urban Footprint. We started this a few years ago, but really all just feeling really concerned about this problem of pedestrian safety and darkness. And so we conducted some of our own research to try to figure out some of the things that are going on. So just a little bit of background, y'all probably all know this, but I think it bears repeating, and this is from the Governor's Highway Safety Association Pedestrian Safety Spotlight Report that is a couple of years old now, but really kind of highlights, if you look at the trends, that we were sort of lulled into this idea that we'd made all these improvements in safety, and I think we did when we reached a near 30-year low in pedestrian fatalities in 2009. But that ended up being an inflection point rather than a continuation on the decline. And we see in the orange line, which represents fatalities in daylight, that while there's been an increase in daylight fatalities for pedestrians from 2009 to 2018, the real increase came in at night. And you can see the blue line represents those fatalities that occurred in darkness. And of course, if this had the more current information, these trends would have more or less continued. A different way to look at that data is to look at it by the percentage of pedestrian fatalities over time that have occurred at night. And I want to point out that for decades, more pedestrians have been dying in darkness than in daylight. That's a decades old problem, but we're seeing it get worse. So again, from 69% in 2009 to 76% in 2018, and that stayed about consistent. You know, we're seeing about 3/4 of pedestrians dying in darkness, and that actually changes depending on where you are in the country, as I'll show you in a little bit. So we wanted to take a little bit of a different tactic for understanding pedestrian safety in darkness. Many brilliant scholars have come before all of us here and have looked at this, and the way that they've treated darkness has been as a correlate, in general, as a correlate amongst other factors for understanding pedestrian injury severity, crash frequency. And true enough, darkness always shows up as a significant factor in those models. So we wanted to do something a little different and examine how common crash factors, like the things that we see over and over again in our studies, are associated with the probability of a fatal or serious pedestrian injury crash that had already occurred, whether it occurred in darkness or in daylight. So really just trying to isolate the darkness aspects of it and what might be more associated with a crash that occurred in darkness. So we took 2012 to 2017 FARS data and 2012 to 2017 TIMS data, which is essentially processed SWITR's data from the state of California. And we looked at that data, that range, because we actually started this research in 2019. So that was the latest that was available at the time. We did a series of bivariate analyses to try to get a first line understanding of what was more likely to have been associated with a crash in darkness. And then we put all of those variables into a series of binary and multinomial logit models to try to understand those factors that were more likely to have been associated with a crash in darkness versus daylight for pedestrian fatalities nationally. So we did a FARS model. And then for pedestrian fatalities and serious injuries in California, so using that TIMS data, we also did those models separately to look at whether there were differences between the two or whether it was pretty consistent when they were pooled. And then we also looked at that FARS data by lighting conditions, so in comparison to a baseline of daylight, dark lit conditions and dark unlit conditions. And for all of these, the unit of analysis was the pedestrian. So just getting straight to the findings, we found some pretty strong, significant correlations with darkness and characteristics of roadway design. So you can see here that for roadways with 4 or more lanes compared to roadways with 3 or fewer lanes, and this is a variable that was only available in the FARS data. That's why there's a US after in the parentheses there. Fatalities were 1.2 times as likely to have occurred in that condition in darkness as compared to daylight. State highways, a variable that was only available in the California data, the fatalities that were associated with state highways were 2.1 times as likely to have occurred in darkness as those in daylight. And for serious injuries, it was 1.8 times as likely. Keeping with that trend, local roadways were less likely to have been associated with fatalities that occurred in darkness versus daylight. And that makes sense based on what we know about design and speed, but it's also nice to see that our results are consistent. In that same vein, we looked at speed limit and speeding. And this is important for us to make that distinguish between those two. Because I think we often think about speeding as an erroneous behavior, a behavior that we need to address, and it definitely is. But what we found is that actually the results were stronger when we just looked at posted speed limit, which is not a behavior, it's a part of our operational design. So compared to 25 miles per hour, fatalities that occurred at 30 to 35 miles per hour were 1.5 times as likely to have been in darkness versus daylight. And then that increases when we look at those that occurred at 40 miles per hour. And this was one of the areas where when we looked at lighting conditions, so the dark lit conditions versus dark unlit conditions, we saw a very high odds ratio for those 40 mile per hour or more those fatalities that occurred at a speed limit of 40 miles per hour or higher in dark unlit conditions in particular. So speed limit matters. The way that we design our roads matters. Speeding does also matter, but we did not actually find a significant difference for serious injuries between speeding related crashes that occurred in darkness versus daylight. And actually we found a lower likelihood of those crashes having occurred in darkness. Again, doesn't mean that speeding doesn't matter. It does, but our speed limit matters quite a bit, and the way we design our roads matters quite a bit. We also looked at other parts of operations, so having a functioning traffic control signal versus not. This was a variable that was only available in the TIMS data, and we saw that functioning traffic control variable, when that was associated with a fatality or a serious injury, that was actually associated with a lower likelihood of that having occurred in darkness versus daylight. And there's some sense in that in a couple of ways. First, please remember that all of these are multivariate models. So this is after we've controlled for all of the other things that might have mattered more or less, this is what we found. And that a key aspect of darkness seems to be, surprise, surprise, we just can't see as well. And when we can't see as well, we cannot detect information as quickly, and we cannot react as quickly. And so if you have a situation where you're forced to slow down because of a traffic control device, that actually allows you to detect and react more quickly. So less likely to be associated than with a fatality or serious injury in darkness. We also looked at whether or not the crashes occurred at an intersection. We did not find a significant difference between fatalities once we've controlled for all of the other things in darkness versus daylight for fatalities, and there was a marginally significant difference there for serious injuries. In keeping, again, with the same train of thought, we looked at driver movements, and particularly drivers going straight versus turning. And for all of the models, we found a highly significant association between that movement of the driver going straight and a greater likelihood of the crash having occurred in darkness versus daylight. And I would say, again, that this makes sense to me from the what can you see, what signs are you getting to slow down? When you're turning, you are forced to slow down somewhat, right? When you're driving straight, if there's nothing else telling you to slow down, you're not going to. And then we're back in this situation where you just may be going too fast for conditions, even though we as a profession design those conditions, and you can't detect and react in time. We also looked at pedestrian location and behavior. In particular, we looked at pedestrian crossing not in a crosswalk versus a crosswalk. And then specifically for California, there's another level of that variable that is in the roadway versus the crosswalk. And in both of those cases, we found a significantly higher likelihood of the fatality or serious injury having occurred in darkness when the pedestrian was either not in the crosswalk as compared to in the crosswalk, or in the roadway as compared to the crosswalk. Thinking again about where crosswalks tend to be located at intersections, or maybe other things that are again helping to sort of influence the driver to be paying more attention there. There seems to be some sort of protective effect, although this needs to be further investigated. In the national data, there is a variable that looks at whether the pedestrian was in the travel lane versus elsewhere or in the roadway. And that was, if the pedestrian was in the roadway, that is associated with a much higher likelihood of the pedestrian having been killed in darkness versus daylight. Other pedestrian and driver characteristics that showed up as significant in the model, we think that these are often actually really related to exposure. So compared to a baseline group of age 16 to 64, pedestrians younger than age 16 or equal to or greater than age 65 were much less likely to have been associated with a crash, fatality, or serious injury that occurred in darkness as compared to daylight. That makes sense when we think about who tends to be out in darkness, right? It's not generally our younger kids, and it's not generally older folks who, there's a lot of safety guidance saying, hey, it's harder to see at night. It's better to not be out. That's not, of course, the case everywhere in all places, but in general, that is what we see from the model. And a similar result for the drivers age 65 or older, they're less likely to be associated with a fatality that occurred in darkness as compared to daylight. Male pedestrians, the same thing. So compared to female pedestrians, we saw that male were significantly more likely to be associated with a fatality in darkness versus daylight at the national level. We did not actually find a significant difference in California for fatalities, but we did for serious injuries. And again, a lot of that is probably exposure related. We also looked at pedestrian characteristics in terms of race, and this is not a new finding. Others, such as Dangerous by Design and other research, has found that some of our some groups in our society are at significantly greater risk of being involved in a traffic fatality than others. And particularly in darkness, we saw that with Native Americans and Black non-Hispanic Americans compared to white non-Hispanic Americans. So those pedestrians who were killed, Native Americans and Black non-Hispanic Americans were significantly more likely to have been killed in darkness than in daylight. We saw a maybe counterintuitive or the opposite trend, at least amongst Asian non-Hispanic pedestrians in California for serious injuries only. We also, as you might not be surprised to hear, found a significant correlation with alcohol usage, both on the part of the pedestrian and the driver, as well as with hit and run. So all three of those being more likely to have been associated with fatalities and serious injuries in darkness as compared to daylight. Again, there's some exposure and collinearity happening here with just the fact that alcohol usage is higher at night, and hit and runs are associated with alcohol usage as well. So we're seeing some of this just being an overlap of, yes, this is more likely when that behavior occurs. Nonetheless, it's still important for us to understand it as part of the puzzle. A few other factors, and then I'll move to key takeaways. We also looked at where these fatalities were occurring, and we found that when a fatality occurred in the Sun Belt as compared to other parts of the country, that fatality was significantly more likely to have been associated with darkness versus daylight. You can see in this map here on the right that there is that band of a dark gray, and then Michigan up there in the top, where 80% of the fatalities, pedestrian fatalities that occur in the dark gray, occur in darkness versus daylight. We think there are a lot of reasons for this, but it's certainly an area that we still need to explore and understand better. We also saw that there was a negative association with crashes, fatalities that occurred in clear weather for those that occurred in darkness versus daylight. And this makes some sense, right? If you are driving at night and it's dark, it's hard enough to see. If you're driving at night and it's dark and rainy, it's even harder to see. So we would expect that the adverse weather conditions would actually, exacerbate whatever difficulties there are in darkness. In contrast to some of the more recent discussion about the harm of SUVs, which I fully agree with a lot of the complications that we're seeing with SUVs getting larger and larger and having a disproportionate impact on our traffic safety picture, we did not see this in the model. And I do think that more or less this is largely a fact of the passenger cars still being the bulk of our fleet. However, it does bring up a question about whether or not there's something about SUVs that actually has a little bit of a mitigating impact for crashes that occur in darkness. For example, if it's just that SUVs tend to be newer, so the headlights are in better condition or are more likely to be adaptive, or if there's something about the higher nature of the headlights actually doing a better job at night of illuminating a pedestrian. This is something that we need to further investigate. The likelihood of the fatality happening or the serious injury having occurred over the weekend, which we defined as from 5 p.m. on Friday to just before 6 p.m. on Sunday, that was significantly associated with the crash having occurred in darkness versus daylight. That's not entirely surprising either, based on what we've just talked about with the weekend being associated with more entertainment, more alcohol usage, that kind of thing. So key findings. Fatalities in darkness do differ from fatalities in daylight. That's pretty clear from the model in some important ways, even if there are trends across both darkness and daylight that we need to be addressing. And in some instances, severe injuries, the trend for severe injuries differs from the trend from fatalities, even if there is a general alignment between the two. We also did find that lighting levels for some key variables are differentially associated with significance. So like I talked about with the 40 miles an hour being really problematic in the dark unlit conditions in a way that didn't show up for dark lit conditions. And in general, the relationship with key correlates of crash severity, so things that we already know are a problem, just seem to be really exacerbated in darkness as compared to daylight. So that includes speed, it includes number of lanes, roadway type, alcohol usage, things like that. And this, we think, comes down to the fact that our visual capacity is compromised at high speeds. As this figure shows, this is a figure from Tool Design that shows that when you go from 20 to 40 miles an hour, your field of vision is really decreased, and simultaneously you actually need more time to stop. So you have less time, you need more. And that result then is really harmful for people who are involved in a crash, and particularly for pedestrians who don't have any body armor. And this tends to be even more the case than in darkness. 90% of our information intake is visual, and essentially at night, we are driving with a curtain around our eyes. So we are really missing that critical peripheral vision information that just can come in daylight, and it can't come in darkness, except for, as we'll hopefully hear later on in this presentation, how lighting can mitigate that loss for us. So some key takeaways for us: that we need to adapt practices to treat pedestrian safety specifically at night. We need darkness to be a use and design case, if not the use and design case, because it is when the vast majority of pedestrians are being killed. And we need to really understand what we can take in at various speeds and various lighting conditions, and then design for that. Because when we design for daylight, we are really not designing for the time of greatest harm for pedestrians. We need to prioritize reduced speeds. This is critical. Even with all the lighting in the world, if you do not have time to detect and react, you will not be able to stop the crash. So that reduced speed aspect is really critical to improving pedestrian safety. But increased visibility is also critical. We need additional roadway lighting, we need better roadway lighting, and we need high visibility countermeasures. Along with that, we need improved crossing opportunities. We do see that even if it didn't show up, the intersection variable didn't show up as significant in our multivariate model, once we had controlled for all of the other things, we do know that the majority of pedestrian fatalities are occurring in darkness, are occurring at mid-block locations. So we need improved crossing opportunities with high visibility countermeasures that will tell drivers to slow down and or completely stop so that someone can get across safely. NTSB did a great pedestrian safety report a few years ago, and a few of their recommendations are really relevant here. That we need, additionally, vehicle-based safety countermeasures, adaptive headlights. We need to rethink vehicle design rather. We need collision avoidance technology. We need to rethink infrastructure planning, including those pedestrian safety action plans and design guides to, again, explicitly include darkness as a part of that, and site-specific planning. And I would include in this that there is a responsibility we have as communities, that when we design places for nighttime activity, particularly if alcohol is involved. I live in Portland, Oregon. We have a very strong microbrewery culture here, for example. We have also a moral obligation to do more to ensure that people have a safe way to get home. And then we need improved pedestrian safety data. You heard me mention exposure many times, but the reality is we do not have temporally adjusted exposure. We don't have sex-based adjusted exposure. We're missing some critical aspects. We don't know about racial differences in racial exposure. We're missing some critical bits of information that would help us better contextualize the findings that we have. But I do want to emphasize that these have to occur in addition to the roadway and operations changes. These are not the answer alone. And then finally, I do want to reemphasize that we want to explore some of these trends that we saw according to race, age, and sex. For example, this is not an exhaustive list, really understanding lighting effectiveness according to various skin tones, looking at countermeasure effectiveness for people of different body types and sizes, for example, people in wheelchairs or shorter people like our children, and then understanding the impact of glare on visibility and vision for both pedestrians and drivers of different ages. I was dismayed to learn that my vision has already degraded so much from when I was just in my early 20s. Even if I show up fine at the doctor's office, our vision is degrading over time in a way that I think we don't acknowledge as a society, and it shows up more so at night. And then finally, there is ongoing research on this topic. NCHRP 1797, I'm the research director for that project with Safe Streets, but we're partnering with some amazing folks, including folks at Tool Design and the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee and Oregon State, to do a really holistic multi-methods investigation of pedestrian safety in darkness, including crash analysis, focus groups, driver simulation, practitioner interviews, with the goal of providing guidance that's specifically tailored to improving pedestrian safety in darkness. So thanks so much for your attention, and I would be happy to answer any questions in a later time, and just really appreciate y'all being here.
Thank you, Rebecca, for that. We did get so many great questions that we'll hopefully have some time to answer later. Some of the questions there may be beyond some of the research that you did as part of this project, but lots of really good probing questions that probably could serve as future research topics. So thank you everyone for sending those in. We're going to shift now to a presentation from Michael Dunn and Matt Stygles. We'll talk about some lighting options and some recommendations for improving lighting. So whenever you all are ready, please go ahead and bring up your slides. I'll confirm that we can see them okay.
Great, thanks, Dan.
Thanks, Dan. Can you guys see my screen?
Not yet. Try that one more time.
Yep.
Matt, sorry. Okay, you're all set now. Thanks.
Great. Well, thank you all for joining the webinar today. I'm going to start us off and then Matt will take over later. But we'll be sharing a brief overview of FHWA's new pedestrian lighting primer. I guess Dan is more proper than me. He says primer. I say primer. Oh, well. The primer was published earlier this year, and it's currently available actually on the FHWA nighttime visibility webpage that George mentioned earlier, and I believe a link was put in the chat, so definitely take a look at that. The primer is intended mainly for use by transportation practitioners who are interested in lighting design considerations for locations with pedestrian activity. It's not a standard, it's not a detailed design guide, but it can be a great introduction to lighting design for safety professionals who may not have a lot of experience in that area. It can also be a great resource for lighting professionals, who are experienced in lighting design, but maybe are interested in digging into some of the key factors related to designing lighting for pedestrian safety and security in particular. And so the primer is a companion to the Street Lighting for Pedestrian Safety research report that FHWA released in 2020. And that report provided some recommendations for lighting for pedestrian safety, particularly related to children and safe routes to school programs. It considered a pedestrian ability to detect hazards on walkways, the visibility of pedestrians to motorists, and also some impacts that lighting can have on pedestrian decision-making on whether or not to cross a roadway. So the goal of the primer is to highlight how the results from the research report can be used to complement common lighting design guides. And you can see here on the screen a graph that's very similar, in fact, to one of the ones Rebecca presented. I won't dwell on these statistics too much since she covered them in such great detail, but really just want to establish the fact that, pedestrian traffic fatalities in general have been steadily increasing in both frequency and as a proportion of total traffic fatalities. And then on the next slide, we see another graph that looks specifically at pedestrian fatalities in dark conditions. And it shows that, once again, they're increasing both in frequency and as a percent of total pedestrian fatalities. And so we obviously have an issue here in dark conditions with pedestrian safety. So Matt, if you don't mind, click into the next one. As that graph showed, 76% of pedestrian fatalities in 2019 occurred in dark conditions, and this was an increase from 69% just 10 years before in 2009. The increase is certainly notable and important to pay attention to, but it becomes even more compelling when you realize that only around 25% of traffic volume occurs during dark conditions. This means that most of our pedestrian fatalities are actually occurring during the time of day when fewer vehicles are on the road. And additionally, crash statistics show that minority communities, as Rebecca also communicated, experience a disproportionate burden of the pedestrian fatalities in dark conditions. In addition to these crash safety concerns, dark conditions can also have negative effects on what we call in the primer pedestrian security. So this would be issues related to crime and also perception of personal security. And since dark conditions reduce visibility and recognition, they create additional blind spots. They can increase that level of personal risk, whether it's real or perceived, and also increase fear. And women in particular report experiencing fear at night that actually constrains or affects their travel behavior. So several studies have concluded that lighting can reduce nighttime pedestrian fatalities and injuries. And these studies have produced a spread of different crash modification factors, or CMFs, that quantify this reduction in crashes in the number of vehicle and pedestrian crashes. And the primer actually goes into a little more detail and kind of catalogs these different CMFs. But you can see on the slide, they range from 0.58 to 0.19, which represents a range of a 42% crash frequency reduction to an 81% crash frequency reduction. And the range depends on the crash severity that you're interested in, as well as other factors like urban versus rural and facility types. And so you can see, you know, an 81 up to 81% crash frequency reduction is very significant. Some studies have also shown that pedestrian safety is influenced not only by lighting presence, but also the quality of the lighting that's provided. One really kind of foundational study was on US 19 in Florida, which at the time was actually had the highest pedestrian crash frequency of any road in the country. More than 82% of the nighttime crashes actually occurred on segments that already had lighting. But the researchers found that road segments with lower illuminance levels were associated with higher frequencies of nighttime pedestrian crashes. And one other note about pedestrian lighting improvements is that they can have especially important benefits to school-age children. These children often walk or bike to and from school or other school-related activities, you know, during the early morning or the evening hours, and depending on the time of year, this can be during twilight or even total darkness. And children are especially vulnerable to vehicle traffic. They're smaller in stature, more difficult for motorists to see, and also are less experienced at judging the speed of oncoming traffic, the direction of it, or anticipating other road user behavior. And previous studies have actually shown that child pedestrian injuries increase significantly in dark conditions. So this is why pedestrian lighting improvements are an important aspect of Safe Routes to School programs, and also why the focus on child pedestrians shows up, you know, throughout the FHWA research report as well as this primer. So in addition to improving pedestrian safety from a crash standpoint, lighting can improve the personal security of pedestrians. Several studies have shown that new or improved lighting increases pedestrian perception of security, which is important from a behavioral level. And also factors like illuminance levels, the type of lighting, the quality, the distribution of the lighting can affect that perception of security. Additionally, other studies have found that lighting improvements not only improve the perception of security, but actually improve crime occurrence and reduce crime occurrence, and can even reduce crime occurrence on adjacent unlit streets when you improve lighting throughout an area. So there's several documents that, you know, some are newer than others, some have been around for a long time, that provide general information on lighting warrants and design criteria. You can see kind of the foremost of these on the slide here: the AASHTO roadway lighting design guide, the TAC guide for the design of roadway lighting from our neighbors to the north up in Canada, NCHRP Report 152, IES RP 8-21, which was an update last year from the previously used RP 8-18, and then FHWA's informational report on lighting design for mid-block crosswalks. And this is just a selection of some of the guidance that's out there, some of the more commonly used guidance. But in general, these documents do emphasize the needs of motorists primarily. And so the companion report to this primer, the research report, identified several gaps in these existing resources. For instance, visibility of children by motorists in low light conditions, and understanding that better, as well as understanding the differences in light requirements between adult and child pedestrians so that they can maintain adequate visual performance. And then also the report recommended that it would be good to know the optimal light levels for visibility for both pedestrians and drivers on different facility types like sidewalks, roadway segments, separated pedestrian facilities, and others. It would be great to have that kind of broken out by facility type. Furthermore, universal metrics for pedestrian lighting would be beneficial, and then also understanding the effects of different lighting sources and luminaire types on pedestrian visibility. So these all do remain gaps in existing research. So I hope that this quick overview of the first portion of the primer really kind of underscores the need for improving pedestrian lighting practices and hopefully gave you a good sense of the benefits that improved lighting can have on both crash safety as well as personal security. I would encourage you to check out the primer for more detail on the various statistics and research reports that I shared if you'd like to learn more. And so at this point, I'm going to hand the reins over to my colleague, Matt, to talk you through the lighting design process and, more importantly, the key considerations for designing lighting with pedestrians in mind.
Thank you, Michael. So as Michael shared with you all, a lot of this background research and safety data and existing gaps, and that was part of what we consider chapter 1 of the primer. Chapters 2 and 3 dive into more specific applications of, okay, how do you design a lighting system? What considerations go into your decision making? What's important, especially for pedestrians? And how do we apply that? Chapter 3 of the primer is a specific design example where we illustrate each step in the process. Now, when the primer addresses design, it's really talking about everything that takes lighting from a plan or a vision to a construction plan on paper. So it also includes concepts like warranting, deciding what design criteria you want to achieve, selecting your equipment and controls. So it's not just laying out and designing for foot candles. That is only step 5 of the process. So it's a broad process here that we can walk through. And step 1 would be assessment of needs, or what we would consider warranting. There are well-established warrants for most roadway lighting applications, and they tend to come from sources like AASHTO. IES is the Illuminating Engineering Society, RP8. NCHRP has several reports out that can provide guidance for warrants, but when we talk about pedestrian lighting systems, there's not that much guidance out there. That's truly the big gap. So even if you look at the TAC guide from Canada, that's one of the more robust systems out there for warranting. There's really little guidance in terms of pedestrian facilities. Often it's case by case, and what agencies can do is we would encourage you to engage the public, especially in an equitable way. We participated in a STEP scan tour in 2021. That's the Safe Transportation for Every Pedestrian program from FHWA. And there were 6 state DOTs that participated in this scan tour. That was Colorado, Florida, Idaho, Maine, Minnesota, and North Carolina, with participation from FHWA as well. So a pretty good footprint across the country. And what we really found is the methods that these state DOTs are using to justify pedestrian lighting range widely by region, climate, by funding ability. All of these things may play a role. And what we came up with during that discussion was a group of factors here that most frequently come up when agencies are making decisions about pedestrian lighting that might guide your decision. Tapering down to groups 2 and 3, which occasionally come up, but really don't more peripheral context for your decision. So these tools on the screen are not meant to be one size fits all. They're just tools available in the absence of all the other guidance that doesn't really address pedestrian lighting very well. And we're continuing to trend towards more specific and prescriptive guidance. Step 2 of the lighting design process would be selecting your design criteria. And the primer considers 2 main categories of design criteria. That would be your primary criteria is your target lighting levels, what you want to shoot for when you're laying out your luminaires. So that's most frequently, we talk about luminance and illuminance. There's a slight difference between the two, but again, those are your lighting levels, and that's what you calculate in software. There's also a second group of criteria, which focuses more on the aesthetics of the system, comfort of road users and pedestrians, and really focusing on efficiency of the system overall. So again, on this primary design criteria, just really briefly so we all understand, luminance is a measure of how bright a surface is perceived to be, especially by the road user or a motorist. So that's measured in candelas per square meter. The other variable we look at is illuminance, and that's the amount of light that might strike a surface. So think about rainfall hitting the ground. If you were to measure that as a variable, it's sort of like what illuminance is the amount of light hitting the pavement. So traditionally in a roadway design, you might look at horizontal illuminance, which is depicted on this left side of the screen here. That's especially helpful when we're talking about just flat roadway design, highlighting pavement markings, just orienting a motorist. But when we talk about pedestrians, there's a vertical element that becomes especially important. And that you could think of sort of in the same vein as a headlight striking the vertical surface of a pedestrian and lighting up their vertical surface. And this is so important to help drivers identify objects in the road, to determine if it is a pedestrian, recognize if it's a threat, if you need to stop the vehicle. Without that vertical component, you really don't have a great system that allows a driver to detect objects in the road. So that's a key element and is well established throughout all of our resources when we look at design criteria. The primer takes us a little bit of a step further towards a less common but more helpful variable called semi-cylindrical illuminance. And that's very similar to vertical, except that it accounts for some of your lateral light sources as well. So rather than just one uniform direction of light from in front of you, it's all sources of light in your surroundings. And the primer takes all of this research that Michael alluded to, some of the emerging topics for pedestrian detection distances, and some of these semi-cylindrical recommendations. And the primer provides this table, which is really some of the meat and bones of the primer. When you look for designing a PED facility or a roadway facility, you're likely to go first to AASHTO or IES or the TAC guide. This table here in the primer is meant to be a supplemental design criteria to take it a step further and apply some of the most recent emerging research topics. So depending on your type of facility, where you may be, if it's a mid-block crosswalk or you're at an intersection, urban and rural, the primer will guide you towards applying some more targeted design criteria. The primer also addresses equipment selection of your lighting system, and that includes all of these topics that we see on the screen here. So that's luminaire mounting height. We could talk about pedestrian scale lighting, which is commonly under 20 feet in mounting height, versus roadway lighting, which may be more 40 to 50 feet or even higher for interchanges. Bug rating, which is backlight, uplight, and glare ratings, really just gives you an idea, an understanding of how much light is being wasted away from your target area. So again, that speaks to efficiency of the system, putting light where you want it on the system and not adjacent into residential or sensitive environmental areas, or upward into the sky as well. Luminaire wattage is the power input to your light, which controls the lumen output. And that's closely related to all of these variables in it, to be honest with you. So what you may see as you work through a design problem is that when you change one of these variables, you might consider changes to all of the others as well. And wattage is a commonly adjusted one. IES distribution describes the shape of light that might be cast on your facility. So it could be very linear, it could be round and symmetric, anything in the middle. Those are variables that the designer has to play with. Color temperature is also a very important topic in recent research. I saw this has come up in some of the questions already, where obviously research shows that the higher your color temperature, or the more cool and blue the light is, the more it might impact circadian rhythm, animal ecosystems, fauna and flora. So there have been shifts away from that in recent years towards the lower end of that spectrum. And this research in chapter 1 would also point out that there's a relationship between detection distance and your color temperature. So if you go too far to the warm end of the spectrum, you might lose some of that color recognition, detail detection, and you won't be able to recognize a pedestrian quite as far in advance. So the primer recommends sort of a balance of color temperature between 3000 to 4000 Kelvin. And many agencies are sort of adopting similar range as well, trending more and more over recent years into the warmer area. And then aesthetics overall of the system. If you are in a historical area, National Park Society, sometimes those characteristics play into all the other variables as well. The primer discusses control strategy, which might include topics like adaptive lighting. That's the one that the primer traditionally explores the most. And it provides some resources for the reader to find more design criteria. And that really addresses just adaptive dimming of the system. When pedestrians may not be there, then you can reduce the light output at night. And the final step here would be design and verification. And there's some nuance in this design process. So when you use a software system, you might find that it will provide the correct values, but there are other considerations that designers should be looking at that would help produce what we consider a good lighting layout. And that's, for one example, is this negative positive contrast. Pole locations are very important in the design process. So we want to encourage pole locations that are in advance of pedestrian that will light up their front surface and assist with that detection distance as well. Chapter 3 of the primer does provide a brief design example, and we can quickly walk through this here. So the design example that we provide is a urban 5-lane arterial, and one that separates a school and a park with a transit stop in the way. So lots of pedestrian activity at night, and the primer walks through each of these steps and emphasizes the decision-making process, what you might think about specifically for pedestrians for each step of the process. Again, the key concept I want to target here is the critical pole locations for this design example. So when we talk about positive contrast, these are the locations of poles you want to set first. This is what sets the spacing for the rest of your design and assures that you get positive contrast for your pedestrians in the crosswalks at intersections. And when we talk through the 5 steps of the design process, what you don't see necessarily before you get to paper is obstacles like intersections and utilities underhead, overhead. Sometimes it can be difficult to place a pole. And what we want to do is make sure we get the most critical ones first. So in this example, that would be 1 in each intersection in advance of the intersection, and 1 on either side of mid-block crosswalk. And if you read through the design example, it might strike you that this is an iterative process. This is not something that you do once and you come up with a good lighting solution. Often it's many iterations. You might test a layout and then check your design criteria and see that some of it may fit your design criteria. Some of it may need some massaging and revisions. So this is just one example here where you can see that the vertical illuminance component of this step in the design doesn't quite meet what your target is. So the designer would go back and adjust some of these variables in equipment selection enough times that we can get a solution that meets all your design criteria. So the primer, again, it's a tool for managers and planners. It's a tool to help you make informed decisions and understand some of these concepts about what goes into a good lighting design. For more practical designers, the primer provides a way to get some of that latest research in pedestrian safety right to your fingertips in a really practical way and give you some new design criteria to consider when you're working on design. And that was our last slide, but again, look forward to discussion, and please feel free to reach out to Michael and me afterwards if we can get a chance.
Thank you very much, Matt and Michael, for that information. I'll have to remember to say primer instead of primer from here forward. I'm not sure why I pronounce it the way I do.
Stick with your guns, Dan.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll have a showdown here. Let me now shift our discussion. We've been kind of talking big picture, macro level stuff. I'm really excited to bring the conversation to a more local level, hearing about some real work that's being done on the ground by a group in the Portland, Oregon area. We have 2 panelists here from representing Oregon Walks, Brandon Summers and Zachary Lartz, and to share some of the work that's been done by that group to look at pedestrian safety as an issue and specifically kind of focus in on some of these lighting topics we've been talking about. So please, gentlemen, go right ahead whenever you're ready.
Great. Hey, just let me know if you can see our slides.
Looks good.
Here as
Yes.
well. All right. Great.
Awesome. Great. Hey, folks. We're Oregon Walks. We're a pedestrian advocacy organization. We're based in Portland. We do most of our work in East Portland, where traditionally disinvested communities. And we do a few different things. We do policy presence. So we're advocating in the halls of City Hall at the regional level and at the state level. And then we also do just hosting of walks, right? We find partners and we get on the street with people. Sometimes you just need to, kind of hold each other's hands and hit the streets and show people how to be there and do that safely and build social community in that direction. And then we have our hands in kind of the education space, teaching people how to access their walk shed, meaning the spaces where they can get to by walking and not getting into a car in order to complete an errand or to go see a friend or whatever that happens to be. really appreciate the opportunity to be here with you all, especially being the last group just during the holidays. So thank you for your attention and your time. We appreciate it. We hope we'll bring some value to your day. So again, my name is Zachary Lauritsen. I'm the interim executive director. Our previous executive director was elected. So in some ways, that's a wonderful thing because now we have someone on the inside who's making decisions. But I'm stepping into that role. My previous role was organizing on 82nd Avenue. And we'll talk very briefly about that at the end of our presentation. Brandon Summers, he's my partner here today. He was one of our collaborators on this report. He's going to be sharing some about the history, some of the findings, some of the conclusions that we found. He'll talk for about 12 to 15 minutes or so, and then I'll step in and talk about kind of the right now advocacy work that Oregon Walks is doing along 82nd Avenue. So with that, I'll pass it on to Brandon.
Thank you so much. Oops, there we go. So as Zachary was saying, I'll try to get through this quickly. We took a more location specific view. We didn't have quite as large of a data set, understandably being from Portland, but the Oregon Walks Fatal Pedestrian Crash Report took a look at the 48 fatal pedestrian crashes from 2017 to 2019. We began the report in 2020, and that was the most recent data that we have. So what we'll look into today is the idea of lighting from infrastructure standpoint, lighting from an equity standpoint, according to our data, and kind of reiterating this idea that we've heard in the presentations before us, that lighting is not necessarily enough in isolation. It really is about a holistic view and the solutions that make a location, especially a location where a fatal pedestrian crash has occurred, more safe. The impetus for the report was this kind of perception that had been going around, including, as you can see here, from a quote from our Portland City Commissioner in 2019, that a lot of the pedestrian deaths were being caused by distracted pedestrians looking at their phone and crossing the street. We've all heard this before. And Scott Kocher, who was on the board of Oregon Walks at the time and is a pedestrian safety advocate in Portland, very strong one, wanted to take what we could data-wise that was available from the city and see what the merits to this, what we perceive to be bias were. So what do? We first started by ordering 48 police reports, which took a while to obtain. And then we took a look at all the laws and ordinances and news reports, and especially relied on Google Street Views. This was during the pandemic, so that was our way of going out to these locations and being able to assess a lot of these things. We pulled aside the hard data that we could from police reports and measurements that we could make from Google Street Views onto an Excel data sheet. There are tons of sheets in this, and it's available if anybody wants to really dig into this. But public-wise, we put out a 3-part report, which has one section on crash reviews for the 48 crashes, summarizing infrastructure issues and crash facts. There's a facts and figures report right here, which all the graphs and tables are pulled aside in a presentable way. And then the focus issues look more closely and discuss actually things like transportation equity, homelessness, distraction, enforcement, and even things like vehicle type and size and other things. It all lives on OregonWalks.org. The reports can be downloaded. There's also an interactive crash map where at every one of the fatal crash locations, you can click on one of the dots. It pulls up the data in a table on the right, and you're able to actually click through to the crash review that's related to that location. This is an example of what a crash review looks like. There are 3 panels. There's the first paragraph is a brief location of a description of the infrastructure of the location and those kind of facts. Second paragraph takes a look at the pedestrian path and facts. And then the third paragraph is driver paths and facts and a summary of the impact. And, so in this instance, we can see that Mr. Fuq Chan was crossing from the Chinese Community Center here to 113th and Southeast Division, which is in East Portland. We'll learn the significance of that later. And he was struck on the south side of the road while he was walking to his car by a vehicle traveling eastbound. The second slide for the crash reviews has as close as we could get to a driver and a pedestrian perspective using those Google Street Views, just to kind of see, on the ground level, what this crash may have looked like. Of course, this is approximated. We had to do the best measurements we could from police report descriptions. And then the third panel is a summary of crash location infrastructure issues. So in this instance, what we see is that there's a lack of traffic calming. There are nearly 1,800 feet between signals. So there's nothing to really slow vehicles down. We've got a wide 5-lane arterial. And we did have the data from Portland maps to show us that 77.8% of drivers do exceed the posted speed limit of 30 miles per hour, with 766 daily going 40 miles per hour. So this is a big takeaway, not just for this location, but overall, you know, there are these arterials, people are speeding too much, and that's causing a lot of these crashes. This, to tie in with the more lighting specific focus of this webinar, did have a lighting issue. And the way that we were able to look at lighting was Portland does provide Appendix K guidelines as part of this PED-PDX plan that came out in 2019 that looks to the future of construction. And they give guidelines for average maintained foot candles and a uniformity ratio. We didn't have the capacity to hire an engineer to go out to all 48 of these locations. We took a look at a few of them with an engineer we were able to partner with, and the hunch that we had about lighting inadequacies were confirmed at all the locations. So what we do is we use this street view data to see, you know, if there are any, pardon the pun, but glaring lighting deficiencies. In this case being the fact that there are lights only on the north side of the road. There's 150 feet between them, and Mr. Chan was hit on the opposite side of the road where there were no lights. So I'll zoom out a little bit, tell you a little bit about the Oregon Walk's findings on a bigger level, and then we'll take a look at the findings related to darkness and lighting specifically. So this is very important. We looked at the location of our crashes, and we found that there is a very distinct dividing line, as Zachary will talk about later, between what's known as East Portland and, you know, West Portland, or the rest of Portland. 82nd Avenue and everything east of 82nd Avenue are traditionally underserved. You know, we have a higher number of people of color, lower incomes, and we found that 50% of the crashes occur there. When you adjust them for deaths per 100,000, it's more than double those west of the city. And as I was saying before, we have these crashes occurring on, you know, not surprisingly, arterials, 67% of them in East Portland at that, and 4 or 5-lane roads. We did take a look back at distraction data just to kind of, you know, allay those concerns. It's tough to get the data on that. You know, police reports often leave it out or just don't check the box for it, don't think about it. But in the 26 crashes where we did have an analysis of distraction for the pedestrian and the driver, none of the crashes, according to police, occurred because of distraction. So focusing in on a lighting review, again, in the absence of being able to go out and make these foot candle measurements, we looked at a Google Street View to look at you know, long distances between street lights, looked at the police report for any note of lack of functioning lighting, or if they wrote somewhere in the report that the area was not lighted, if there's any language like that. And what we found was that on a broad view, 79% of crashes occurred when it was dark. You know, and you can kind of see the note down there. Police only said that 3 of those crashes happened because of dark, not lighted. But when we were able to take a look at the street view and kind of compare some of those PVOT Appendix K guidelines, we found that 58% of the crashes that occurred when it was dark had lighting issues. And our recommendation was to put these in a report and say, this is as far as we can go with this. Take this information, city, and go out and let's make the measurements there. Let's look at this from a lighting standpoint and hopefully on a more holistic standpoint as well. But at the time of the report's release in 2021, lighting had been upgraded at only 2 sites where fatal crashes occurred, and 21 locations still had unresolved possible lighting issues. And this brings us back to kind of this example that we were looking at earlier of a 113th and Division in East Portland. This is a street view of the what the street looked like at the time of that crash, at the time when Mr. Chan was killed. We have 5 lanes. There are, you know, there's a signal way down here, 1,000 to 1,500 feet, another one close to 500 feet behind this one. We have lighting on the north side of the road. You can see a Cobra head here, and the other one was just slightly off frame here. And Mr. Chan was killed near this pole with no lighting along the entire south side of the street. We know that this is frequented by pedestrians. There's a goat path here worn through what at that time was a vacant field, leading to some of the housing over there. And it's characteristic of the dangerous road that we all know, an arterial, and oftentimes in the outside of the city where there's just unmitigated speeds. People can go fast, it's dark, and people are going to be hit. Fast forward to 2022, and we'll see that there are changes to the infrastructure. There's now a Cobra head over the south side of the road here. It's most likely associated with the new development here. Obviously no longer a field there. We've got a bus lane only here. A sidewalk has been built. There's a concrete divider. They've shut down the crosswalk, the unmarked crossing that was at 113th. And these changes are made, but fundamentally this location remains the same. It's still a 5-lane arterial with 1,500 plus feet between marked signalized crossings or anything to slow down vehicle speeds. And if a pedestrian wants to cross, they're going to have to go anywhere from 1,000 to 2,000 feet out of the way walking. So stuff has been built there, but not necessarily solved. And this brings us to this idea of where these types of improvements are being made and transportation equity. So backing up to this PDX report that was put out in 2019, PBOT they were not getting enough response from communities of color, and specifically Black Portlanders who primarily live in East Portland. So they held 2 focus groups, and they wanted to know, what are the concerns? And poor lighting was listed as the primary concern for Black communities, and you can see the comparison on the right there. And this has been mentioned before, it's as much of an infrastructure concern as it is a personal safety and security concern. But for the purposes of our report, we looked at it in an infrastructure way. And PBOT actually also has this equity matrix that we can see where race and income data are overlaid. If we look on the right, the darker the color, the greater the inequities, and we can see a dividing line pretty distinctly between 82nd Avenue and all the area east and that area of North Portland. We took all of our crash data and we overlaid it on this equity matrix. There are a lot of findings, and you can view them in our report, but as they relate specifically to lighting issues, we found that a majority of the crash locations with lighting issues were located in East Portland, 77%. And that specifically 8 out of 8 of the pedestrians who were identified as Black were killed when it was dark. And at 7 out of 8 of those crash locations, lighting issues were determined to be a factor. Elsewhere in our report, there's a strong overlay of crashes in general with these trauma impacted communities that are in East Portland. And this brings us to an even closer on the ground focus that Zachary will lead us through 82nd Avenue.
Great, thank you so much. So best for last, anyone? Sounds great, right? So 82nd Avenue.
That's right.
I want you to take a pause, like a moment. I know we're busy days, but pause for a moment and think about this corridor in your community. It's the 5-lane arterial. It has almost no turn management, access management. So visualize that in your head, because for the next 4 or 5 minutes, I'm going to talk about Portland's 82nd Avenue and some of the efforts and things that are happening along this corridor. So 82nd Avenue used to be the north-south corridor on the east side of Portland. The suburban explosion happened and it became consumed by the kind of sprawl of Portland to the east. And now if you look at a map, 82nd Avenue is actually dead center of East Portland. It's the core, it's the central part of East Portland. And it used to be owned by the Oregon Department of Transportation. And over the course of many years of advocacy and funds from a number of different directions, it was jurisdictionally transferred from the state to the city. And now here's this fantastic opportunity where the city has money, resources to transform this space that is currently incredibly pedestrian unfriendly to a space that is friendly. So while I'm speaking from a space where we do have some resources to make these changes, I do want you to kind of visualize that space in your community and how that might move forward. I'm having a visit from my little 3-year-old. Sorry about that. It's like the Zoom thing, right? In this era.
I love it.
So Rebecca, talked about how the data around local roadways results in a lessening of the effect of pedestrian fatalities. And that's really one of our big goals, is this idea of let's change this traditional highway, this throughput tunnel, to a space where people want to believe. And we believe by achieving this, we really change the nature of the space, which includes the idea of pedestrian level lighting. So if you'd hit the next slide here. So this is PBOT's analysis of the gaps of lighting on 82nd Avenue. Those black lines indicate where there is no lighting on the street and or insufficient lighting. And they have committed to this jurisdictional transfer that there will be lighting throughout the corridor. But as Michael and Matt spoke about, the type of lighting also matters. And so what they're proposing is super high level Cobra head lights. And that's fine. That's a start. It gets lighting in the corridor. But what our coalition is advocating for is that the type of lighting matters too. And in especially pedestrian cores, we need to invest into pedestrian level lighting. And actually, Frank, in the question and answers, he had mentioned this idea of like lower pedestrian scale lighting. And so the reason we have been advocating for that is because we think pedestrian level lighting does a couple different things. One is it improves safety. There's more lighting for pedestrians to be seen. Number two, it has a placemaking effect. And when you make a place more for people, more people show up, more people that show up creates a space where motorists are slowing down because it is a pedestrian area. It is not just a throughput area. And then our coalition is advocating for pedestrian level investment because that is what our BIPOC communities have been asking for. They're saying we want lighting so that we feel safe and that we are safer. So that gives a little bit of the challenge, though, is we hear from PBOT is we don't invest in pedestrian level lighting. That's usually not part of our scope. And so that's kind of where this tug is happening as advocates, where we can come to this space about how to spend some of the resources. So get the next slide. Actually, we're going to skip this. Go to the next one. We'll talk about crossings really briefly because I know we're short on time here. So this is an example of 82nd Avenue had very few crossings. And so much like Division, where Brandon talked about it, long distances for people to get to a safe crossing. And PBOT and the Oregon Department of Transportation have committed to all of these dots are enhanced crossings along 82nd. Improves safety. It encourages people to go to spaces where there's a lit crossing, and that makes a huge difference. There's a second thing that we are advocating for, which is enhanced transit along the corridor. And the result of enhanced transit here may be even a road diet, so that we go instead of 2 travel lanes in each direction to 1 travel lane in each direction, which again brings significant level of safety because you're reducing the distance that pedestrians have to travel across, horizontally across. So we share all this, or I share all this, to say that we recognize that these conversations are all about trade-offs. There's a space trade-off. So you're giving space to wider sidewalks. You're giving space to road diets for transit enhancement. We also recognize there's not an unlimited pot of funds. This is something all of us on this presentation understand. There's not unlimited funds. And so that what Oregon Walks tries to do is open up a space to have open and honest conversations about those trade-offs. Are we going to pave a little bit less of 82nd, repave a little bit less of 82nd so that we can have pedestrian level lighting and pedestrian nodes? Or are we maybe going to sacrifice some of our median access management in order to add another crossing? But I think I speak very honestly about this, which is our society needs to have these conversations about trade-offs and about reallocating space and resources. And in the context of this conversation today towards lighting, and until we have those honest conversations, we aren't really digging into kind of the realities of like the holistic solutions to pedestrian safety. And I just want to do one last little piece, which is to say, Rachel had put a question in the Q&A about navigating darkness being more complex for folks with disabilities. And I couldn't say, it's absolutely spot on. And yet another one of the equity matrices that we bring to the table when we're speaking with PBOT, and we're saying, not only do we need better lighting, better pedestrian lighting, more crossings and curb cuts, but we need to do that first before we're investing in the primacy of vehicular travel. So I'm going to stop there. I know there's questions that have been floating around, and I'm going to pass this back to Dan to take us home.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate it. Let's get into this discussion period. We do have quite a few questions. If I could ask our panelists to come back on video if they can. Let's get into as many of these as we can. Thank you for hitting on that last point, Zachary, on this issue of individuals with disabilities, certainly a population that is going to have more challenges and then exacerbated by these lighting issues. There were several questions that came in about what we know from data. Perhaps Rebecca can weigh in on this, and then maybe in the story from Portland about unhoused individuals and those who experience housing as a primary concern, possibly being overrepresented in some of these crashes. Some questions about that issue. So I wonder, Rebecca, maybe first, if you can elaborate and maybe remind us whether you look at that as an issue or not.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. So I just want to say one of the reasons that I loved having this group together to cover the various aspects of this is that it is a really multifaceted problem, and we need to be looking at it from different angles. And I have many times sung the praises of Oregon Walks, and you're really detailed looking at the crashes. So while you had a smaller number, you were able to then go in and really do a detailed look. Because the reality is that we don't have data on housing status in VARs, and at least we haven't traditionally, and we don't typically have it in state data. And so we are missing some critical elements of understanding the problem when we are only looking at these large data sets. I'm obviously a person who looks at large data sets, and I think it's really critical to do that and to understand broad trends, but it's just as important for us to do that deeper dive that other scholars like our friends from Oregon Walks have done, because just unfortunately, Dan, we don't have that kind of visibility. At least we haven't traditionally had it. And, I think there's a robust conversation to be had with, how do we improve those national data sources and state data sources so that we can get visibility into some of these challenges that seem to have increased over time and that are really important for us to understand.
Yeah, for sure. And Brandon, you've got your hand up. I wonder if you've looked at this.
Yeah, just to add to kind of what you're saying, Rebecca. So the data we have from our look at the 2017 to 19 fatal pedestrian crashes in Portland showed us that 21% of Portlanders who were killed were experiencing homelessness. And this is from the data that we were able to find. There was a 2019 point in time study that said 0.5% of Portland's population in 2019 was experiencing homelessness. Again, it's hard to know how accurate this data is. It's a really difficult thing to get an accurate number on. Another report said 2% of people in the Portland metro area were experiencing homelessness in 2017. But either way, even if it's above that, it's vastly disproportionate. And we were alarmed when a study came out, or the reporting came out from the Bureau of Transportation last year, saying that, I don't want to get the number wrong, but it was much, much higher. Maybe 70% of people killed in 2021 were experiencing homelessness. And it just shocked us. So we have a report in right now with the city to get all of the data we can with the police reports associated with those deaths to update our understanding of this specific issue, because it's just so shocking.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, thank you for that. Certainly an area where we can do more work in our data and in our research. Looking forward. I wanted to come back to a point that Zachary, you raised in your final part of your presentation on this question of the overhead lighting, traditional roadway lighting, and then looking at pedestrian scale lighting and two different kind of beasts there. And I actually wanted to shift it to Matt and Michael to ask, you all talked about some of the primer and what it recommends. With all the other guidance that's out there, can you point us to any good resources for kind of looking at this question of either or, maybe in combination, whether we're using all of these lighting styles, and how should that be approached?
Yeah, great question. I'm happy to take that one. So I would first review some of the guidance that's come out of the IES and in their documents. That they've got the most comprehensive and specific guidance that's used in the United States for that sort of recommendation. Certainly, we're not intending to sway anyone towards higher lighting. In general, the lower you can put it and still feasibly make a good lighting layout, the better for all road users. One of the only drawbacks that we can point to with lower lighting is you do get a little bit of increased glare, but again, as your overall brightness of the area increases, that may not be such a major drawback compared to the benefits. And I did want to share with the group too that The primer references some recent research that looks at higher mounting heights versus lower mounting heights. And what they found is that when your luminaires are 20 feet or lower, your detection distance actually increases about 5 to 10 meters, regardless of how bright the facility is. So across all spectrum of light, if you go with lower mounting heights, your safety performance should go up.
Interesting. That's interesting. Thank you for that. And I wonder to what degree, well, I don't know, we don't have this data, Rebecca, but I wonder when you're looking at doing research and whether you're doing this kind of research on kind of looking at lighting data, like agencies that have like a layer of where their lighting exists. I wonder to what degree we even know kind of the type and the placement of these types of lights and that and get to that granularity of detail. It makes it maybe difficult to kind of look closely at safety performance for pedestrians in one condition or the other.
Yeah, it's a real challenge. That said, for NCHRP 1797, we took a two-pronged approach just to the crash analysis alone. And then, as I mentioned, we're doing also the focus groups and the driver simulation and other things to try to really get at a holistic understanding of this. But the way that we've done it, and I see that Dr. Bob Schneider is actually in the audience. So hi, Bob. And if you want to type in anything into the chat, we can answer it or add it. But Bob has been leading our macro level analysis. So again, looking at the national data and updating essentially what I showed you all earlier, doing an updated analysis of all of that, including asking some questions and examining the data in ways that we've since learned that we need to over the last couple of years. But we also have a micro level crash analysis that I'm leading, which is going to pull data from multiple cities. And that's to get at what you're talking about, Dan, to try to really get into the layers that cities with that kind of data could have. It's a challenge because we also are considering other aspects of this. And like you said, a lot of cities don't have great lighting data there, but we've even planned to go out and do some original data collection to try to get a better understanding of that. But it is really true that if we, if we really want to understand this problem, and again, back to sort of that holistic effort that Oregon Walks did, to go out and actually gather that data feels really important so that we're not making generalized statements that aren't really applicable. I just want to point out that one of the things that I found so impactful from your work, Brendan, was when you found out that there was lighting maybe on one side of the street and not on the other. And so just having even that level of detail would allow us to dig into our data in a much more nuanced way, and then ultimately be able to provide better recommendations to the profession.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I had a question, actually, Dr. Schneider did offer a question earlier that I wanted to get to. Several people brought this question up. Has anyone considered the need, or perhaps there are examples of this, where cities are setting lower speed limits in areas that do have lower light conditions or known areas where lighting is an issue? And then someone else asked, are there any examples of where cities have set different speed limits at different times of day to kind of look at when light conditions get lower, we're actually lowering speed limits, maybe similar to how you do for a school zone during certain times of day? I'm just going to toss that question out there to ask if anyone has any input or thoughts about that.
I have to go find it, but I was doing research on this exact idea when we were looking into just kind of hypothetical solutions for Portland, when we were realizing that there are so many locations with lighting issues. And I do recall there was maybe it was in Arizona, where there was like a nighttime reduced speed for a city. But I can go find that. I'll make some notes and see if I might be able to share that with anybody that's unfamiliar with it.
I will say that in our work, which part of which Bob has led, we actually didn't find a lot of examples of that. And it's something that Bob and I've talked about a lot. And I think some of this gets to, I just don't think as a society, we are willing to be honest about the way that our faculties are impaired at night. Not talking about alcohol, not talking about anything other than the fact that 90% of our intake for from the average person, 90% of that is visual. That's an incredible amount of information. To then go out and have essentially blinders on is a substantial impairment, and we don't seem to acknowledge that in our roadway design and operations. So it's sort of like the first step is admitting that you have a problem, and to actually then allow people to say, okay, like I get this. Yeah, a reduced speed limit at night makes sense.
Zachary and then George, want to weigh in on this one?
Yeah, I would just add a couple little thoughts. One is reducing the speed limit has wonderful intent, but unless there's some sort of enforcement mechanism, and the nighttime when there's fewer vehicles, we see speeds go up because there's fewer vehicles in the way, so to speak. And so we take issue at Oregon Walks with when we hear from dots that say, oh, we put the sign up and walk away, instead of making fundamental changes to the infrastructure in order to slow people down.
Point taken. Yeah, definitely. George?
Yeah. And I just wanted to add, I mean, it is not an uncommon concept to have a reduced speed limit on a road during periods of darkness. We've probably back in the day all seen the speed limit signs that have the white with the black legend on the top, and then the black with the white legend on the bottom that says at night. However, though, I do not like the idea of reducing a speed limit as an alternative for an agency to consider in an urban area or an urbanized area as an alternative to considering visibility improvements. Don't believe that you'll find it to be a very effective solution. I don't know this for a fact. I'm always against higher speeds. I'm always for lower speeds, but I just don't think I would equate the two things as an alternative to one for the other.
Yeah, the point taken to getting back to Zachary, your response, it's lowering speed limits, but then also making some design decisions to facilitate a lower speed, and those probably need to happen hand in hand to send the right message. There were some questions, Matt and Michael, I'll get back to you on this one. Some questions that came up about for an agency that may be looking at their resources, they can do a limited amount of work on some key areas, looking at doing corridor lighting projects versus kind of focusing attention on crossing lighting, crosswalk lighting at established crossing locations. How would an agency balance kind of how to approach that work? Do you find that systemically it's better to kind of look corridor wide and just go ahead and blanket our lighting where we know it's needed, or find those really maybe higher risk locations where the crossings may be happening at the established crossing, marked crosswalk, and focus attention there first? What would you recommend going about that decision making?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Dan. I think there's definitely pros to both approaches. The systemic approach of, it certainly is a great way to go about it. But also I think it can be important to focus on areas where either you have a lot of pedestrian activity or areas where especially areas where you have a lot of pedestrian activity and maybe gaps in your lighting system. Because, some of the research, as I mentioned, shows that providing lighting can actually influence pedestrian activity and pedestrian crossing behavior. And so if you have, say, mid-block crosswalks that aren't lighted, that could be a great kind of first candidate for using those limited resources, trying to both make your existing infrastructure safer and also encourage that pedestrian activity kind of towards those more safe crossing locations.
Right.
Matt, I don't know if you have anything to add.
Yeah, I totally agree with everything you said, Michael. I would just share that, depending on the agency, sophistication, and resources, it might not be feasible that they can do a targeted approach. But when you look at recommendations and standards, the design criteria for, say, mid-block crosswalk with high volume is likely to be totally different than a sidewalk on the side of a road that's a 4-lane arterial. So the design is different. If you take a blanket approach to your system, you're probably missing on some of the biggest opportunities to improve your safety. So it should be a targeted look.
And then I wanted to pitch this last one to Zachary and Brandon, and then have others jump in, hopefully. As coming from the advocacy perspective, how do you find that, take this issue of lighting specifically, that's what we're here to talk about. How do you find that the way that you make your case or message on this issue to kind of establish that broad buy-in or get some support behind it? How do you make that case and focus attention on this? In some ways, I feel like lighting can be a very clear issue in people's minds when they see differences in different environments, and the way you showed it and demonstrated it, it really lands. But I wonder to decision makers, other community members, folks you're trying to bring on board with this issue, how do you find the communication strategy should work, maybe for others in the crowd who are in a similar position?
I'll take a stab, Brendan, and feel free to jump in and add. I think people are moved by different things, right? Some people are moved by data, just hard data. Talk to them with data. Some people are moved by going out and experiencing it, going on a walk at night with people who are making decisions. Some people are moved by personal stories. We had another pedestrian die yesterday here in Portland. And so, you know, the strategy has to be that you meet people where they are and what's going to move them in their decision-making process. And then overall, you know, we see our role in Oregon Walks is to really shift the Overton window towards the person, the human level, as opposed to the vehicular.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. And I would say that, you know, people are moved by a lot of things. Everybody is moved by their own experience. So if you're able to use whatever it takes, like you're saying, data, you know, even anecdotal stuff to get people to go out there, especially very knowledgeable people that are engineers, to go walk these areas and see them and feel them. You know, you're going to come away with a different perception of a lot of the stuff that you'll see from just a data perspective. You'll be there and say, yeah, this feels unsafe because it's dark or all of these different things. And you're going to be able to put all those puzzle pieces together. And that was kind of the focus of our report, and the way that in which it was holistic was to say, you know, we can't say in a blanket way, like, lighting is terrible here, you must look at exactly this location. But all of the overlays of the limited data that we had kept adding up to this idea that East Portland is the place where we need to focus. So go walk those streets, walk 82nd, go out, feel those communities, feel those neighborhoods, and then you're going to really have an understanding of what the needs are. And you can look at that data and make these targeted changes.
That's great. Thank you for that. Unfortunately, I have to close the discussion there because we're out of time for the webinar today. I want to let everybody get back to your other meetings and commitments, but thank you all for being with us today and talking about this issue. I happen to know Frank Markowitz, who's in the crowd today, and Rebecca Sanders will be involved in another webinar that ITE is putting on a similar topic in February 2023. I recommend getting in touch with ITE or us, and we can point you in the right direction to learn more about that. I dropped a link to a survey in the chat. Would really appreciate your feedback on the webinar today, and that'll lead you, as you complete it, to a certificate of completion for the webinar. That information, that link, and some of this other information will be coming to you in an email tomorrow. We look forward to having you tap back into the recording and the slides and all that, and learning more. Thanks to our panelists for joining us today and sharing their work, and thanks to all of you for being with us, and we hope to see you next time. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Happy holidays.
Everyone.